This is the Morningstar Report on Revolution Radio. This is Robert Morningstar and my co-host Scott Teeters. Today is April 15th, 2018. It's a momentous day. It's a very sad day. The most significant tragedy in maritime history occurred today, 106 years ago today on April 15th, when RMS Titanic went down. And it is a tragedy that touched the whole world. I would say that when the Titanic went down, it was a tragedy as big and as well known as the Challenger disaster. And it was something that the world still has not forgotten, as you can see, the tragic loss of this ship. And so it is with a certain degree of sadness and a great degree of reverence that I want to say a couple of prayers for these people. Two short prayers for sailors. And one is called the Pilot's Psalm. It's actually a Psalm of King David that you're all familiar with, but it's been rewritten for a sea pilot. And so it says, "The Lord is my pilot, I shall not drift. He guides me across the dark waters. He keeps my log. He steers me in deep channels. He pilots me by the star of holiness for his name's sake. Yea, though I sail mid the fenders and the tempests of life, I shall dread no danger, for he is near me. His love and care shelter me. He prepares a harbor before me in the homeland of eternity. He anoints the waves with oil. My ship rides calmly. Surely sunlight and starlight shall favor me on my voyages, and I will rest in the port of our Lord forever." I say that prayer as much for my father, who was a merchant marine captain, and I have grown up always close to the sea. That's why I hate to say it, I love the Midwest, but I could never live in Kansas in a landlocked state. I need the ocean. I am an Atlantic man. I was born in the Atlantic, and I hope that I will live forever on the Atlantic. Now here, this is called the benediction. And the reason I cite it is because I first heard it recited by a very famous sailor in all our lives. The first time I heard these words said, they were spoken by John F. Kennedy, captain of PT Boat 109. And he said, "God, be good to us, for your sea is so wide, and my boat is so small." Amen. So with that, I would like to welcome Scott, and we have waiting in the wings a very special guest who awakened me. I think that he's got to turn down the volume on his audio because I can hear my own words echoing back to me. So, gentlemen, please lower the volumes on your monitors there. His name is James Gianninoto. He also has his own program every week at midnight on Fridays called The Whole Agenda. And Gordon lives in Maine. In the midst of the tempests, similar to the ones that the Titanic was facing when it attempted to cross that ocean, April 12th, April 15th. And Gordon has a very intriguing story to share with us. But first, I'd like to ask Scott to relate to us, the common story, or what what you think about Titanic and the everyday story, and then we're going to make some analogies between Titanic and um, the World Trade Centers, of all things. So, Scott,
Well,
take it away while I get something else ready over here.
when I was a little kid, somewhere in my teen years, one night I remember there was an old movie on. Most of the time when people talk about films, the Titanic, we think of James Cameron's movie from about a dozen or so years ago. But I think it was somewhere in the 1950s about the sinking of the Titanic.
Yep. Well, let
And
me
I
say
saw
that,
that.
Scott, let me say this. The movies that you're talking about, one is called Titanic, which was around 1955, and then in
Right.
57 or so, A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. So those are the
It was one
archetypal
of
films.
those, but
Yeah, go
I
on.
remember seeing that movie, and of course it wasn't anywhere near as dramatic and cinematic as what James Cameron put together. But I remember going to bed that night and just finding the whole experience it just must have been absolutely terrifying. I've never been someone who's ever been comfortable being out on a boat or a ship with a lot of distance between me and the bottom. It's just not something that, yeah, that's what I want to do. I don't know.
Mhm.
Maybe in a past life I died in the ocean or something like that. I just don't know. But when the James Cameron movie Titanic came out, at first I thought, what's the surprise here? We all know how it ends. The boat goes down the water.
Yeah.
But I think that was a 3-hour film,
Oh, it
and
was.
well, I went to see the movie, and it was just absolutely captivating. And when it was finally done, I remember thinking, I can't believe that was a 3-hour movie. It just flew by. Um, and that's about the extent of my fascination and interest in the Titanic. It was maritime things are not really something that have ever grabbed me in my life, but how can you be
Mhm.
in our culture and not have some exposure to the sinking of the Titanic? So
Right.
I'm really curious and interested about this alternate theory that
Yeah.
it wasn't the Titanic that went down, it was the Olympics. So I'm anxious to hear this.
Yeah. The other thing is this: that there is a fourth movie. All right. I spoke about Titanic, which was an Anglo-American production. Then A Night to Remember, which is the famous world bestseller by Walter Lord around 1957 and 58. But in the 1940s, the Germans, Nazi Germany, made a movie about the Titanic, and they actually tell the real story. Of course, it was labeled propaganda by the British and Americans. Even after the war, the movie was suppressed for many years, and fortunately, I think it was about 2 years ago, the Turner Classic Movies showed it, and I was really impressed because there were hints of sabotage, of intentional grounding. And the story that Gordon is going to tell us is a real eye-opener. Gordon told it to me about 4 years ago, and it sparked my curiosity. And during the show, I will discuss how I did some enhancements of the wreck on the bottom of the sea, which seems to support Gordon's thesis, which, of course, it's not technically his thesis. Gordon was fortunate enough to read a book many years ago also by a German author, as I recall, which told this real story, or this alternate scenario, which is actually much more credible and believable than the idea that the greatest luxury liner the world had ever seen, the biggest ship on the waters, that on its maiden voyage it should just ram into an iceberg, which are pretty big, even if the night is dark, you still see it. So again, now I think I hear
And the night was
Gordon.
clear, as I recall hearing from the
It was a
official
clear
story, that
night.
it was a
It was a
starry
clear
night.
night. It
So
was.
how could you miss a big
Well, they did see
iceberg.
it. They did see it. There were a couple of mistakes that the man at the wheel, the pilot, the first mate, he made a really big mistake. He reversed the engines. That was to try to slow the ship down to avoid impact. But when he did that, this caused a burbling of the waters passing over or across the rudder, and the ship became less maneuverable. Whereas if he had plowed full speed ahead and hit hard to port, he would have avoided it. But that's Monday morning quarterbacking. The ship was huge. It was 52,000 tons, and that is 7,000 tons heavier than the USS Missouri was. The USS Missouri, battleship of World War II, was 45,000 tons. And then it was 882 feet long, small by comparison to our aircraft carriers, but no one had ever seen anything like Titanic. So I would like to bring in Gordon. Gordon, welcome to the show. I'd like to introduce you to Scott Teeters, my co-host and longtime friend. Gordon?
I was unmuting. You must do that. Instead of Scott, in that when I was 6 years old, my father, he liked to go to psychics, and he equipped himself with a Woolen sack tape recorder, and then he'd come home and play the tape, and his secretary would type it out. And he asked about me as his first question, and the first thing the psychic said was, "Buy this boy a boat."
That's a nice psychic. I would, yeah, boats are a wonderful invention.
I was fortunate enough that my mother, in the divorce from my father, had and he had been a bad boy, so she was entitled to an alimony, and said, "Well, you're going to pay for me to take your two sons to Europe." And so we sailed on the New Amsterdam across the Atlantic in May.
Wow.
And we sailed back on the New Amsterdam in July, and we spent 11 weeks. We were on a little tour. There was about 15 of us in a bus, and we toured 11 countries.
Wow. Listen, may I interject? You have a 6-year-old story. I'd like to give you a 6-year-old story too. I was about five and a half, I think, going on 6, but I was awakened very early one morning at 6 in the morning by my Uncle Tony. And he dragged me to the television set, sleepy and groggy, and he showed me the television and said, "Look, this is the first time anybody's seen this." And it was a luxury liner going down. And for 4 years or years after that, I thought that I saw the sinking of the Titanic. It was actually the sinking of the Andrea Doria, which is another famous shipwreck. But I remember that so vividly, waking up. And then another one, which is even more important as far as the psychic element is concerned. This happened to me in 1968. I dreamed that I was watching CBS News and Walter Cronkite was the anchorman, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to inform you that the wreck of the Titanic has been found on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, miles off Newfoundland." And then 25 years later, I saw that report from Ballard, and it was really amazing. And I always knew from that dream that it would come about. So those are my two dream stories, and I would like you to take over the narrative now.
Okay. So everybody else was getting seasick because the voyage over was a little bit rough, but I never get seasick ever. So anyway, I loved it because I could order smoked salmon every night for dinner, and then they had a saltwater pool deep in the ship, and I would go down there, and the ship was rocking so much that the water would stand up from the bottom of the pool to the ceiling at one end of the pool. And they had these stainless steel railings, and I would grab onto them, and then the water would come back like a big wall of water. And I just thought that was great. I practically spent every spare moment in that pool by myself. There was nobody else. And but then when I was 21, I was hired as an assistant photographer to a real jerk, But I had told my girlfriend, if you see any photographers that say they need an assistant, let me know. So I called him up, and he goes, "Can you leave immediately on a ship for the maiden voyage?" And I said, "Are you kidding?" "Sure." So I was getting paid to be his assistant, but there were 12 models that we brought who were gorgeous, and the Cunard was paying. It was a maiden voyage of the QE2, and it was a 3-week cruise to the Caribbean. And every night he tried to date a different girl, And they all knew which order he was going to ask them, and they just everybody let him know in not so subtle ways that he was a jerk. So when we got to Puerto Rico, he had already found out that nobody wanted to have sex with him, and he was going to, and so he left. So I, being the assistant photographer, took over photographing the maiden voyage of the QE2 for the brochures. So I not only got a free cruise, I got paid for.
What a privilege. May I interject a little story about the QE2, which is also the biggest of her time. Now, when Queen Mary II came around, I was involved at that time with a certain maritime organization. I had certain privileges down here at Battery Park. I could get into areas that nobody else could get to, which were directly across from the Statue of Liberty, where Queen Mary II was moored. And to pay its respects to Queen Mary II on her maiden voyage, Queen Elizabeth II came down the river, and I had my high-resolution digital camera filming this thing. The Queen Mary II stood there at anchor by the Statue of Liberty. I got the entire Queen Elizabeth II sailing right up to her and alongside her, and it looked like a collision. I swear to God, this video is creepy because it looks like a collision. But when you see the size of the ship, the Queen Mary II dwarfed Elizabeth. Elizabeth disappeared completely behind the silhouette of Queen Mary II. And it was one of the most awesome sights I've ever seen, because Queen Elizabeth II is close to 1,000 feet long, I think. And this one, it was dwarfed by Queen Mary II. So that's a spectacular sight to have seen. So let's get on with the real story.
So then I moved to Maine and worked on a few commercial fishing boats where you can't tell how deep the water is, but it's definitely deep enough to drown. And I loved it. And we'd be the only two people out there, and he would be underwater raking up sea urchins, and I'd be on the surface making sure the boat didn't crash into the rocks or collide with a reef or something. And so I absolutely loved that. I had whales going by me, eagles overhead. It was just spectacular. So there was this book by this guy, Robin Gardner. Then I read reviews of it. I never actually got my hands on it, I'm sorry to say, but now I can't read because I have impaired vision from taking too many aspirin. But anyway, so I was like, this is incredible. So I started looking into it, and they poo-pooed him because he had been a plasterer. He eventually became an engineer. He was born in 1947 and died in, I guess, last summer.
Now Gordon is going to tell us the remarkable story of the Titanic. When you first told me the story, I was amazed. I was shocked, and then I did the research necessary to confirm all the things that you're going to say. And why don't you tell the people about Olympic first? Tell us the story of Olympic, and then we'll set the stage for the rigmarole that occurred on April 12th to April 15th.
Okay, would you like to hear about the White Star Line, or you want to just go right to the Olympic?
Oh, no. That the White Star Line is a big part of the whole story.
The White Star Line started in 1845 with a four-masted clipper ship called the Red Jacket, and they were sailing from Liverpool to Australia. And
Excuse me,
a good number of those passengers were prisoners, because wasn't Australia like a location for...
Oh, yeah, the Botany Bay. Remember, the Botany Bay from Star Trek got its name from Botany Bay in Australia, where they sent the prisoners. But I would like to ask Scott, Scott, you're not familiar with this story. I would like you to jump in any time and ask questions or comments with Gordon.
No, I'm being a sponge here, guys.
Okay, go ahead.
So, by about after the American Civil War, which had nothing to do with the White Star Line, after that, everybody was making the switch over to coal-powered steamships, and the White Star Line wasn't doing too well, and I don't know whether it went into bankruptcy or it was liquidated or it was sold at auction or it just plain bought by IMM, which is the International Mercantile Marine Company, and that was owned by, I believe, Henry Ishmay. He had a son, Bruce, who becomes important later, but so he bought it. But IMM was itself financed by J.P. Morgan, the railroad magnate from the United States, and he actually had a mortgage on everything that was going on. So that was in 1869. Then in 1870, Henry Ishmay was playing billiards with Gustav Wolff, and Gustav Wolff said, look, because he knew that, Henry Morgan was behind it, so there was going to be plenty of money to build plenty of ships. He goes, look, my uncle and I have a shipyard, Harland and Wolff, in Belfast, Ireland, and if we'd like to make an agreement with the White Star Line that we build all of your ships exclusively, and that way we won't build ships for anybody else. Well, Ishmay really liked that idea, so they shook hands and agreed on it. So they started building steamships, and around the year 1900, Cunard was coming out with for some pretty good-sized ships that went faster than the White Star Line, and they were thinking, what are we going to do about this? And in 1907, they got this idea: let's build 3 Olympic-class ships, virtually identical, and we will specialize because, see, well, it was prohibitively expensive to burn coal, like to go across the anywhere. Like when the Titanic and the Olympic were built, it took 700,000 pounds of coal a day to fire the boilers. Oh, so you could just imagine. So they said, and to go 50% faster, you had to burn 10 times more coal. So they said, instead of building for speed, let's build for the most comfort of any cruise line in the world. Now, in the early days, when they took steerage passengers, they would put them all the liners. So, but Cunard said, let's give them, the steerage passengers, comfort too, and let's have cabins that have between 2 and 10 beds in them. And so that was in the thoughts, and they sketched out, probably on a napkin, their idea for a ship that would be, about 900 feet long. And by the way, the Queen Mary is 70 or something. So anyway, the designer for Harland and Wolff, Andrews, he did an advanced drawing, not blueprints, but an advanced drawing, and he showed it to Ishmay and Imrie. Imrie was the guy that owned International Mercantile Marine, and they agreed that they wanted to build 3 ships exactly like that.
I remember I used to go down to the wharf down here on 44th on the Hudson River and watch the really great. I saw the Ile de France, very beautiful period. The United States was the fastest ship on the water at that time.
Right, set a record, I think.
Yeah, 3 days. Across the Atlantic in 3 days on her maiden voyage.
I grew up in Reading, Connecticut. My mother loved ships, and so you used to pay 50 cents to the Seamen's Union, and you could tour any ship before it left. So I must have toured about 20 ships, ocean liners, before they left.
I remember very vividly when, this is a side note, when the Nautilus went under the North Pole and came to New York, and its victory lap, sea cadets, we all went down to see the Nautilus, but we weren't allowed on it. And I longed to be on the Nautilus. And then a few years later, my friend Robert Anderson, a former atomic submariner, or submariner, depending on your inflection, he invited me to go to the U.S. Submarine Museum in Groton, Connecticut, and I got to be on the Nautilus and walk through the whole thing. I recommend it to anyone. It's a very beautiful museum.
I think it sits there in the yard, doesn't it?
It floats there in the river.
Well, maybe that's just a smaller submarine that's in the yard there.
Oh, in the yard they have a lot of them. They have mini subs. The Japanese captured mini subs are experimentals. They have the Turtle, the original American submarine from the Revolutionary War, is in there too.
Civil War.
Yeah. Civil War.
Yeah. No. Oh, Turtle. No, gentlemen. No. There was a Revolutionary War submarine. It was called the Turtle. You're thinking of the Hunley and the one that went down, but no. This is definitely Revolutionary War. It looked like an acorn. It it had a manned propeller to drive the boat up to what they expected to be a wooden British ship, and it was supposed to screw into the wood a bomb and then go away. But when they got to the British ships, they found that the British engineers had lined the bottoms with copper, and they couldn't be drilled through. But anyway, this is a maritime show, so we're really going far and wide. Back to the Olympic, and
Yeah, so they decided to lay the keel of the Olympic, which was 45,000 tons, and the Titanic was 46,000, and the Britannic was 48,000. But they were the same blueprint, just different things inside. So, and when the Queen Mary came to Bar Harbor, I went out. I had to pay for a cruise because they were surrounding it, the Coast Guard, with machine guns, and but we went completely around the Queen Mary very slowly and really beautiful. So they laid the keel in the spring of 1910, and the Harlan and Wolff shipyard had about between 20 and 30,000 workers, and they all lived in company housing, which were these little brick homes. Some of them had like 15 kids, and they were, let's just say, highly dependent on their jobs at the shipyard. And there were three shipyards that were coalesced into two shipyards side by side, and so a different crew from the second village, right adjacent to the first. You couldn't tell the difference between them unless somebody told you. A different crew started the Titanic just a little bit later. So they laid the keel, and then they did the rest of the hull, and then they launched it, and they forgot to christen it. I don't know if that's a factor or not, but when you christen a ship, shouldn't you say a prayer besides naming it and breaking a champagne?
you say a prayer and you invoke the Lord of the Seas to protect her, and it's really bad to not christen her, and it's really bad to change a name too. Two taboos that we observe.
So anyway, once it was floating, that's when they lowered the interior, everything for the interior and the superstructure. They lowered from the pier into an empty hull, and it had three propeller shafts: the right, the left, and the center. And the right and the left each had huge steam boilers, and the extra steam would be vented to a turbine that ran the third propeller in the center. And it was on its fifth voyage. Its route was the shipyard was Belfast, Ireland, but they left from Liverpool. It was registered to Liverpool. They left from Liverpool, went to Southampton, then they went to Cherbourg, France, and then they went to New York, and then back. So that was the route. And on the fifth voyage, Olympic captain John Smith, but he wasn't at the wheel because it was still in almost just barely out of the harbor. The harbor pilot.
Gordon, your internet is breaking up quite a bit. Could you repeat that? Because I'm getting messages from the audience that sometimes they can't hear you. So would you repeat this about the route from Belfast to Southampton to Cherbourg?
From Liverpool, they took passengers in Liverpool, then they go to Southampton, take passengers, then they go to Cherbourg, France, and take passengers, go to New York, drop off and pick up more passengers. And they were on their fifth journey, just leaving Southampton, with the harbor pilot steering the ship. And they were faster than the Hawk, and the Hawk was almost even with them bow to bow, but as they were faster, they started to pass it. And for some reason, the harbor pilot turned the Olympic a little bit to the right, just as the captain of the British warship turned it to the left. Well, obviously that was the error. Was the British captain, the Navy captain, should have let it go by, but instead he steered right into the starboard side, which is starboard side about 3/4 of the way down, and he rammed it. And the bow pierced from the above the waterline to below the waterline. But all British warships had
the damage done. It broke up. The Hawk struck quite a bit more than 3/4 of the way down the length of the hull, right into the shaft and the engine room. It appears. But
well, no, what it did was it bent the keel, and that could not be fixed. You couldn't. You had to take the ship apart to fix that.
Gordon, what was missed was the exact sequence of events. It broke up when you were saying about the passing the Hawk on its port side. The Hawk should have let it go by, but instead it turned. So that was the part that I missed here.
Yeah, and it turned into it, and the battering ram pierced all the way into the keel and bent it, and the bow cut into the plates, and the plates were, I think they were roughly 16 feet by 8 feet, and they were drilled and riveted with a 1-inch rivet or a 1.5-inch rivet every 6 inches horizontally and every 4 inches vertically. So there were millions of rivets on the ship, and the two 1-inch plates together made a 2-inch hull. And because they were under pressure and bent to conform to the curves, they were even stronger being riveted together than they would have been had it just been a single 3 or 4-inch plate. So anyway, the cruise immediately was canceled. They made it somehow back to Southampton, unloaded everything, and patched the hull as best they could to get it to go up to the shipyard, Harland and Wolff, in Belfast, Ireland. So the Admiralty held a board hearing to see who was at fault. So guess what? The British Navy held the hearing, and they found the British Navy wasn't at fault. Clearly it was at fault, but the reasoning was that the ship was so huge that the suction of it sucked the warship Hawk into penetrate the Olympic, which to me is just, that was the first wrong thing, flag for me, was because that just seems like bad science. I've been in so many boats, and I can go buy another boat.
Of course.
I've never seen one boat that were next to each other, both moving along. I've never, ever seen one suck anything else into its hull.
Of course, it's totally against
the side of the ship expanding away, and
right.
usually drive stuff further away.
Right, exactly.
So it had to have been steered right into the Olympic. So the White Star made a claim for insurance. I think it cost about $3 million to build, and they put in a claim for at least that. And Lloyd's of London said, no, there was a court of inquiry, and it was your fault, so we're not paying. We don't pay when it's your fault.
New York City News came on, but we can continue. Now, on that topic, this is kind of like the Warren Commission report, the fatuous physics of the Warren Commission report.
I was just writing that as a note to mention.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, that is totally against all the laws of physics. As Gordon pointed out, as the boat plows through the water is parted and expands and pushes. A boat that comes alongside is actually pushed away. But what I feel happened now to the captain of the Hawk was that when he felt the push of the weight, and so there would be constraints, for warships. As you get closer to the bank, the water gets shallower, and there is a central channel in most rivers, for example, the Hudson. So when the captain felt his boat pushed to the right, his reaction was to correct it. But
I believe that's true. I feel that's right. What you just said is true.
Yeah.
But I knew when I heard it that was bad science. Give me a break. I've been on boats all my life. I've never seen a boat get sucked into another boat.
Right. So that was the whitewash.
In September 1911, who knew that?
Yeah.
So they didn't have any fishermen at the hearing, I guess. So anyway. They didn't get any money, and they limped back to Harland and Wolff, and they looked it over, and they go, "This thing is totaled." The bow of the Hawk was at an angle, and it went in deeper than the bottom of the bow, but the very underneath the bow was the battering ram, which, first of all, Two of the drive shafts were damaged. The keel was bent, and but more importantly, where the upper part of the bow went into the ship, it sprung all the plates on A deck, which was the first class. Whatever you call that when you go on a sailing.
First class luxury.
Yeah, it was the first class deck, and the plates were all sprung on the right side for quite a distance. So they go, this ship is totaled. Now what are we going to do? And they go, well, we're building the Titanic. We're not making any money from the Olympic. We've got to patch it up and keep going. So they decided to put all these beams across out of one stateroom on the starboard side through the hallway to the outer wall on the port side. So they had the whole hallway there. You couldn't even go down it. It was beams. And then they had to re-drill some holes and re-rivet it. I have no idea of how they patched the holes that didn't match anymore, whether they just re-drilled those and used bigger rivets or whether they welded. I don't know what metallurgy they had back then, but they definitely did not have plasma cutting torches. So anyway, now they've got a ship that lists to port. It leans to the left. It crabs. So when the captain's steering straight ahead, the ship is trying to go to the right, so he's constantly got to steer it back to the left. So people seeing the Olympic go off in the distance would see that it was like zigzagging almost, and they're like, what the hell? And then there was no first class accommodations because the whole first class deck was ruined. So they kept sailing to New York, and then I think in the beginning of 2012, maybe it was in the end of February, somewhere in March maybe, they were coming back from New York. Now the captain was Captain Edward John Smith. Now he wasn't blamed for the collision with the Hawk because the harbor pilot hadn't given the wheel back to him. So the harbor pilot, and they said it wasn't the harbor pilot's fault either, it was the suction. So they're coming back from New York, and I had no idea how shallow the Georges Bank is. I'm really going to look into that at some point. But I know that the ocean floor rises, and I think it rises to, in some places, 20 feet, maybe 50 feet from the surface. And at some point, some steel-hulled ship had sunk right there on the Georges Bank. And it was just under the water, and Captain Smith couldn't see it at all. There was no record of it. There was no warning. There were no underwater sonar or radar. There was no space satellites. There was no international registry of wrecks. There was nothing. So he went straight over it, and it rolled under the whole hull from the bow to the stern, and ripped off the right-hand side propeller. Now, Harland and Wolff had built a lot of ships, and when they built the Olympic, that was hull number 400. So on the propellers, they put 400, and when they built the Titanic, they laid the Titanic keel, they numbered that one 401. So now it had to limp back to Southampton with God knows what damage on the bottom of the hull, and it had to have a propeller. So they were identical ships, so they had to go and take one of the Titanic propellers and put it on the Olympic. So that's why the propeller on the back of the Olympic, the one on the right side, says 401, and the one on the left side probably still says 400, but the way the stern hit the mud and sunk in, the right-hand one is slightly visible, and you can see the 401 on the bottom, but you can't see the left-hand one that would say 400 that would prove that's the Olympic. So anyway, that's why when it broke up and fell to the ocean, the stern collapsed because it was just jury-rigged together, and it didn't take much for the rust to collapse it. So when you go to the bottom, if you ever do, and you look at it, the bow section is relatively intact, but the stern section is completely pancaked, and it's just dissolving into a pool of rust. And of course, plankton loves iron, so there's all kinds of bacteria digesting the iron plates and corroding them, and there's plankton all around eating the iron. So
the high carbon content of the metal that was used on the construction of both Olympic and Titanic grew more brittle when it got into the cold North Atlantic waters, especially sailing around icebergs.
Yeah, National Geographic did a whole documentary on that, and they think that's what happened.
That's what
But
made the impact worse.
that's the least that's only slightly incidental to the story that I'm telling you,
Yeah.
because so now they have both ships in port. The Titanic is almost ready for sailing. It's March. They realize, hey, we can't do anything more with the Olympic. It was totaled when the Hawk hit it. Now it's like beyond totaled, and we still can't get Lloyd's to pay anything. So what are we going to do? We're going to go bankrupt because we can't build the Titanic while we have no income from the Olympic. And if we can't pay our bills, then J.P. Morgan is going to come over from the United States and foreclose on our loan and take all our ships.
Moment to introduce the audience to the financial relationship and the controls, the manipulation that was going on between the banks of London and the banks of New York. They were vying for dominance of the global economy, even as they do today.
And a New World Order people had decided that we needed an IRS act that would be passed by Congress and then ratified by the states to become a constitutional amendment, which required 36 states.
Right. I want to point out to the public that 2 months before the World Trade Center went down, Saudi Arabia sold the World Trade Centers to a developer named Larry Silverstein. And a month before the World Trade Center went down, Larry Silverstein doubled the insurance and the relationship between J.P. Morgan and the Rothschild banks.
The Federal Reserve Act was also proposed, and that was going to create 12 member banks, 9 of which would be owned by the Rothschilds and 3 by the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan. And so there were a lot of very wealthy people traveling in Europe, and when they heard that this was coming up in Congress, they had to get back to New York as soon as possible so they could devote their wealth. And I'm talking about the Vanderbilts and the Astors and other people. And they were going to get back to New York, and they were going to devote all of their energy and finances to stopping the IRS Act and the Federal Reserve Act. So they booked passage on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. So anyway, J.P. Morgan booked passage. He had just had all these bronze sculptures completed for his upstate estate, and he had those crated up and loaded in the ship. Well, what happened is what they're going to do, and they had a meeting. Ismay and Ermey had a meeting with the Prime Minister of England, and they said, look, if we go bankrupt, all the British ships are going to go back to New York, of the White Star Line at least, maybe some others. And you're going to put 30,000 people out of work while there's no economy, and those are practically the only good jobs that exist in the whole UK. And you're going to never be reelected. And we've decided that we have to switch the nameplates and sail the Titanic as the Olympic and the Olympic as the Titanic. And the Prime Minister said, I don't want to know anything about it, and walked out of the room. And so they were debating what to do, and they go, well, we have to tell J.P. Morgan because he's booked on the cruise. So back in the shipyard, they're like, well, we don't really have to change that much. We have to lower the lifeboats off the Olympic and the Titanic, change the lifeboats, change the life jackets. The dishes all only said White Star Lines, and they had to change the menus because the menus did say Olympic or Titanic, and that was virtually it. But then they were looking at the linoleum floor, and it was scratched, and if it's a brand new ship, it's got to have brand new linoleum. And so Ismay ordered carpeting for the whole A deck, which is where the grand staircase came down. There was a linoleum floor. A lot of the other decks were teak and wood, so that, you know, it didn't need to be covered. They could just be refinished if necessary. So anyway, they carpeted it. They hired on the crew. Now, the crew these ships, this village of workers, they're all living in one-story houses, and the ships are 175 feet tall. And to move a ship like that, let's say that you were going to move the two ships out and put the Olympic in the Titanic dock and the Titanic in the Olympic dock, if you were going to do that, you'd have to fire up the boilers for about 12 hours before you could even move the ship. And there was a coal strike going on, and coal was impossible to get, but if you could get it, you had to pay through the nose. So their plan was to sail the Olympic across the Atlantic, hit an iceberg, and sink it. And they go, well, we have to save everybody. So they go, let's take the Californian and have it leave 2 days early and wait in the ice fields for the Titanic to come and hit the iceberg. And then we'll take all the people, it'll come alongside, it'll be signaled by red and blue flares, and we'll come alongside, and the rowboats, the lifeboats will go. There were only 20 lifeboats on. When I say Titanic, I'm meaning the old Olympic, which they had to get rid of. So there were only 20 lifeboats on it, and they filled them. They took 40 minutes to realize they were sinking because they hit the iceberg, but there was no jolt. But one guy said something interesting. He said, I'm sitting in my bed, and on the nightstand I've got a drink, and the ship is listing to the left, and you can see it in the glass, the liquid in the glass. But he goes, all of a sudden, there was the slightest little shudder, and all of a sudden the water was leaning to the starboard, and I thought, I better stay awake because maybe something's happened. And what it did was, it didn't hit it directly, but the pressure of the iceberg against 100 million pound, because after it was loaded with 10 million pounds of coal and passengers and cargo, it was 100 million pounds. That's what sprung the plates and started leaks.
Yeah, crumpled them.
The watertight compartments. It was designed to still float if two adjacent ones were flooded, but not 6. There were 16 altogether. So
here's an interesting point. Here's an interesting point in engineering. It said that they tried to close off the compartments, and they were successful, but what it resulted was an imbalance. And if they had flooded the rear compartments at the same rate that the front compartments were flooding, the ship would have floated 2 hours longer. It would have settled evenly. The waterline would have just risen, and the people would have had a chance not only to get the lifeboats down more safely to the water, but they would have been able to swim away from it instead of the horrendous leaps and falls that we see depicted when the nose went down.
An important little segment here, which is that they bolted new nameplates. There were nameplates on either side of the bow and one at the stern, and they were engraved and riveted into the ship. And they go, we can't cut those out and make another plate that matches it and put it back. We're going to just make up the new nameplate, the Olympic, and we're going to bolt it over the name Titanic. And so that's what they did. Well, when they had hired a crew to crew the ship for the transatlantic maiden voyage, and they all got on the ship, but they started talking to each other, and they go, look, they did not move those ships. They switched the nameplates, and that's bad luck. And this voyage is doomed because we can tell this is the Olympic, not the brand new Titanic, and we shouldn't go on the maiden voyage. So when they got to Liverpool, every single person walked off the ship except 2 people. I don't know what was wrong with them, but maybe they thought, well, nothing bad will happen. This will be okay. They had it all figured out. Everybody was going to be rescued by the Californian.
Yeah, hold on. I want to say something about this. When I heard your story 4 years ago, I was very skeptical. And you told me the story about the plates. So I want to tell the audience that I went and I got the best photographs from the Ballard expedition of the front plate of the Titanic. And it was very, very dark and opaque. But with the computer graphics software that we have, I was able to improve it. And I saw the letter O in part of this nameplate. Where the nameplate has deteriorated, the O in Olympic is visible, and there are no O's in Titanic, and that's when I became a believer.
Where the AN, the upper right-hand bolt rusted, and it sagged down, so it's hanging by the one bolt above the top of the A, and underneath that you can see the M and P, and that's pretty clear in Ballard's video, which we haven't really gotten to yet. But
anyway, that's for the future.
So they had a really difficult time to hire a crew, because even though everyone was out of work, not a ship was sailing anywhere except the Californian, which an empty ship, they loaded it full of coal, and they put on a cargo of 3,000 wool sweaters and 3,000 wool blankets, and it sailed for the ice fields and was told to wait there until the Titanic showed up and sank.
I've never heard that before. Where is that, besides this book, where did he get that information?
I don't know. I might have gotten it from the Wikipedia description of the...
Yeah, because that is a very strange story. The California was so close.
That's at the hearing, at the inquiry, they said to the Californian, what the hell were you doing there? And they didn't know that they didn't have any cargo or any passengers.
Oh.
They just had the crew and 3,000 wool sweaters and 3,000 wool blankets, but they didn't ask if they had a cargo, and they didn't ask what the cargo was. So they said, what the hell were you doing there? And Captain Lord of the Californian said, well, it was a dangerous ice field, and so I stopped. But he was actually doing that.
That's really bizarre, guys, that they would sail a large ship like that into a dangerous ice field.
Gordon realized that these ships burn 700,000 pounds of coal a day.
Yeah, that's hard to imagine, but yeah. Gordon, I had a question for you. You were just talking about how they had a hard time hiring crews because nobody, the common folk that needed jobs, they didn't want to get on this ship. And I want to tie that back to something that you mentioned earlier, that the ship was never properly christened. Now, what I know from my years of study of these Illuminati-type people is they're obsessed with ceremony. And for them to not christen a ship says something. It didn't happen. It did not get christened by accident. Like, oh gosh, we forgot.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah,
excellent point.
And then I'm sure that the locals, the grunts and the people that had the cheap seats and the worker bees, they knew that it wasn't christened, and they said, these are very superstitious kinds of folk. And they said, I'm not getting on that ship.
But also the crew that walked off, they went into town, and there were all kinds of other people that weren't sailing anywhere because there was no coal, and they told a lot of people, so the word must have spread. And that's why the passenger lists are so uncertain, because some people showed up and said, no, I'm not boarding. Even though they were all ready to board, they go, at the last minute, they said, no, I'm not going to do this.
I'll bet you a lot of those guys were Irish.
They walked away, and other people were traveling under false names, and it could be anywhere up to about 1,650 who died, but they settled on the figure 1,517.
Scott, that was an excellent point. And now I get to the point of predictive programming. We know now that movies are used to prepare the public for coming events. And I often say coming events cast their shadows before them. That was said long ago by a very wise man. Coming events cast their shadows before them. And they know this, and they prepare the public with what we now call predictive programming, as we've been seeing for the last 25 to 30 years, depicted in films 10 years before the events unfold. And in that era, the novel was one of the vehicles that was used for predictive programming and preparing people. And we have these two novels that we are aware of that actually in 1898 and 1886. Yeah, the one who wrote the book called The Titan, Morgan Robertson. And there was another one, W.T. Stead. And W.T. Stead wrote his as a prediction. And he said that because he knew the way things were in maritime business, in shipping, in engineering, it was likely to happen. And so these two books were prophecies. Morgan Robertson came to be looked upon as a prophet. But here's an intriguing theory that I've heard recently, or I've read recently. Some people believe that J.P. Morgan read those novels, and he read the Titan, and that he was so underhanded, so evil, so cunning, so wily, that he actually staged the novel to become true.
Gordon, I have a question for you. We're talking about these wealthy men, and Robert, you're absolutely correct. J.P. Morgan was not a good guy. Would he do something nefarious like that?
Oh,
you
man.
betcha. But one of the interesting things I'm reading here, we're talking about these wealthy men. There were 3 of the wealthiest men in the world that were on the ship that went down: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. Why did they get on the ship?
Oh, they were targeted assassinations.
Okay.
That's the simple answer.
They had to get back to New York. They had to get back to New York.
Right, and Morgan knew that they were coming back to New York to oppose his plan to set up the Federal Reserve and the IRS. So I just view those 3 magnates as part of the plot, targeted assassinations.
The plot was very complex because they intended to rescue everybody. So that's why the Californian was waiting in the ice field. So also, the press always followed J.P. Morgan around, and he was told 2 days before the Titanic sailed. So he had his statues taken off the ship in their crates, and he said, "I don't feel well. I feel ill." But everywhere he goes where the rich went, and they had reporters there, and he was spotted 2 days later on the French Riviera in excellent health with his mistress. Ismay's flight canceled, and she went to France, and she said she was ill, and she was spotted with her kids a couple days later, and she wasn't sick at all. So they were told, some of them, and the rest they thought the designer of the ship, Andrews, was on the ship.
Oh yes, he went down. He
Gordon,
went down
what
with
you're
the ship.
explaining here sounds suspiciously like how a whole handful of people, or several handfuls of people, in the days before 9/11 were told, "Don't go to work. Don't go to work."
Yeah. So anyway, there was no first-class accommodation, so a lot of rich people that might have gone on the maiden voyage couldn't book a first-class cabin. They could only book second class, but they were promised that they would, as close as possible, get first-class service, but still that wasn't good enough for them. So that's why the ship only had sailed with 2,500 people instead of 3,500 people.
Oh, one of the points that you made on Coast to Coast last night, which, by the way, was very interesting. They made you give the whole synopsis in 45 minutes. But I came across an article from 1912 that I saved, and I'd like to read it to you. It's called The Just Missed It Club. It is said, Just Missed It Club formed with 5,904 members. It's certain 2 boats the same size as the Titanic could not carry the crowds that just missed taking the lost ship. To date, 2,478 Americans, 2,950 Britons, and 476 scattered, all more or less prominent, have entered the Just Missed It Club. It appears that 4,965 of these had engaged passage but canceled their reservations before the Titanic sailed. Of this number, 590 had premonitions of disaster. The rest were in Paris and couldn't break away. Of the balance, 732 are glad they were not aboard at the time, as they surely would have come home on the Titanic.
That's very interesting. I like that.
Yeah. Let me see. It's hard to read some of this stuff. I counted lucky that I didn't have the price to go aboard this year. If all of us who just missed it had got aboard the Titanic, she would have sunk in the Liverpool dock from the overload. Percival Slathersome, the artist whose pictures are hung in the Paris Saloon, Kentucky, voiced the opinion of the membership of the Just Missed It Club when he said, quote, "I counted lucky that I didn't have the price to go aboard this year. If all of us who just missed it had got aboard the Titanic, she would have sunk at the Liverpool dock from the overload," unquote. Many Titanic victims gone forever.
Well, it was very desirable. Think about it. There's no air travel. You can go on a sailboat, or you can go on the most modern, comfortable ocean liner, biggest movable object ever built. So, of course, you're going to have passage. But the people who went all felt they had to rush back to New York.
Yeah. Now I'd like to share with you a psychic experience that I had in Hamburg when I went to the Titanic exhibit with my friends there, Mikey and Stefan. It was amazing. It was something I did not expect. They had many, many cases, glass cases with the artifacts and possessions of the people on the Titanic. And there were pocketbooks, and there were hats, and there were single nylons, there were shoes, boots, dresses, some of the plates, champagne bottles with champagne still in them. And then I came to a case and I looked down into the case and I saw a pair of glasses, pince-nez, you know, those glasses that don't have the extensions for the ears, the pinch nose, pince-nez. So I looked down into this glass case and I thought to myself, oh my God, look at those glasses. Those are on someone's face on the Titanic. And as I looked into the glasses, I saw a pair of hazel eyes appear behind them looking up at me. And it was a very shocking experience. These objects are energized. The soul energy of the people are still in these objects. And I do believe that it should be left alone. You should not tamper with the possessions of the dead. And that stare that I got through those glasses, you know, it's a glass case. It's got a white bottom, and the glasses are resting on the bottom. And I look into them, and it's quite an experience. So go on,
Robert. Being that you have a propensity for being psychic, it would have been fascinating if you had been able to actually hold one of those.
Oh, I've had those experiences, and they stay with you for a much longer time. Yes. Now listen, let's finish up this story. The outcomes. Okay. The outcomes of this tragedy.
It finally sets sail, and it's going along in the Gulf Stream because that goes up the west side from Florida. It starts curving over to the UK. So they're in the Gulf Stream. Everybody's out on the deck getting a suntan. Very nice. And then they cross over into the Labrador Current. Well, all that water going east has to be replaced by water from somewhere, and most of the water comes from the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The icebergs get loose in the Labrador Current. So the Titanic was doing 22 miles an hour, which, you know, was it could go 24, which for you and me, we freeze at 32. So if you fell in that water, you had about, you know, a minute or two, possibly 3 or 4, but that was it. And the heat transfer of water is incredible. So the heat absorption. So they're coming along. It's cold. There's a starlit night. People said they never saw so many stars, and the ocean was like glass, and it was so calm that everyone that was out there said this wasn't the calmest it had been in days or weeks or months or years. Decades. Now, some people say that waves from a rough sea breaking on an iceberg, but in fact, everyone testified that they could easily see icebergs as close as 6 miles. Before they sailed, there was a fire in coal bunker number 10, and Captain Smith was asked, "Do you want to put the fire out?" Well, putting the fire out means you've got to take all the coal out. If it's burning, you've got to throw it right in the boiler. And you can't put water on it because it would explode, and you can't leave it covered and then have a spark because that would be like a bomb, because coal gas is as bad as gasoline fumes. Captain Smith said, "No, don't worry about it. 100 tons of coal." So he was obviously thinking what actually happened. So they're sitting there, these watertight bulkheads only went up to the D deck, and that meant that as a section filled, it could overflow into the next section. So that was a bad design, believe it or not. Is White Star had lost a ship that hit some rocks, and then it washed up on a beach, and it was pretty good size. And the Harlan and Wolff got the idea, let's build a bulkhead inside the hull and then cut the hull in half and take the stern half back to the shipyard and add a new front end of it. So people were slow to realize that the ship was sinking, and they didn't really do anything until 40 minutes into it. That 40 minutes, Captain Smith ordered the telegraph operator to send messages to the Californian, but the Californian only had one teletype, and he had gone to bed after working 16 hours straight, and they didn't have anybody on duty. And they were told to wait for red and white flares, which would mean the Titanic was sinking, and then come right over and stand off of it so they could unload the lifeboats and send the lifeboats back for more people. So there were only 20 lifeboats. There should have been at least 60 to 70 lifeboats. So this officer said, standing off here, I don't know if it's the Titanic or not. And he said, well, wait for the red and blue flares. Meanwhile, unknown to both the Titanic, and which was really the Olympic, and the California, had lots and lots of longboats, and they had sent crews out to the icebergs to kill seals, which even in 1912 was highly illegal. And Sampson was just still in the water.
I think it broke up there, Gordon. I think it broke up. We lost the name of the ship that was sending out the seal hunters.
Sampson. So
yeah,
Sampson had its own agenda, which was that if they thought they were going to get caught and a ship was on the way to arrest them and seize them, that they would send up white flares. And they wouldn't be very high because they didn't need to be, because they were near the ice floes where the crew was killing seals. So they had white flares that only went as high as the top of the mast on the ship. So they're looking at the Californian going, this is not good. What's this ship sitting here? It's probably radioed for law enforcement, and we're all going to be seized. We've got to get out of here. So the Sampsons start sending off white flares. Well, they were about 6 miles from California. The Titanic radioed its position, but actually the operator, the navigator, was off by 13 miles. But that didn't matter because they had hit an iceberg that was over the horizon from the Californian. So no matter what flares they sent up, they would never be seen. And the Californian telegraph operator never received the Titanic message. So Smith ordered the lifeboats lowered, women and children first, but then he had them lowered away half full because he figured any minute the Californian is going to show up, because they started launching red and blue flares that went up very high, but not high enough to go over the horizon. So the captain, the Californian, woke the captain up and he said, I see flares. And the captain said, we're looking at, what are they? So he went back to sleep. And so meanwhile, the Titanic is sinking, and it hit the iceberg at 10:30 and it sank at 2:20. So it took, roughly 3 hours to sink. And so they started lowering the boats, the lifeboats, and they were pretty much half full. So then the stern went way up in the air, and all of a sudden there was an explosion, and the hull broke in half, bunker number 10, and all that heat and all that coal being red hot in a closed space contacting water created steam that just blew the plates right out, and that's what severed the ship in half, and down it went. So the Californian just kept the first officer said, well, now the ship that was out there it seems like it went off. It launched some white flares and left, and that was the illegal sailors. They later found out with a lot of research who that was. So, meanwhile, what's the name of the Carpathia heard the signal that the Titanic was sinking, was given a location. When it got close enough, it didn't see anything, but it kept going. Lifeboats floating, so it stopped, and it took all the lifeboats aboard, and there were a few people who were dead in the lifeboats, and there were other people that were in the water and still crying out. And some of the lifeboats had tried to rescue those, and some of the lifeboats just pretended that those people weren't there. And so anyway, they got about 700 and something people on the Carpathia, and then the sun rose, and the Californian wireless operator got back on, and that's when he found that it sank. They had flown the whole thing, the Californian. They didn't know where exactly the Titanic would hit the iceberg, but yet they had no wireless operator on duty. The wireless would not, only if you were in the middle of the Atlantic could the signals reach both the UK and North America.
This is a very interesting, also historic significance. That signal that the Carpathia picked up was also picked up by a young teenage radio operator in New York named David Sarnoff. And that was actually the beginning of international news and NBC and the RCA Corporation, because David Sarnoff took that signal to the New York Times, and he arrived with the message that it was sinking long before the official message came through.
So that's just amazing, guys. David Sarnoff, of all people.
Right. As a teenager, I think he was 18 or 19 years old, just like a regular ham operator listening in New York City. Imagine hearing that Morse code come in and seeing it before your desk.
Well, you see, this was just newly invented. Marconi did the first transatlantic transmission in 1910. So that was called a Marconiogram if somebody sent you a telegram.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it was a crystal radio, telegraph.
Yeah, there was no radio band or anybody transmitting on anything because Marconi had supposedly just invented. Later they discovered
it was
Tesla had displayed a radio-controlled boat in a pool in the 1898 World's Fair in Chicago.
Yeah, so but Tesla had already sent signals. Tesla had already sent signals into outer space by 1912.
But what they said was that all ships, after the sinking, that all ships would have to have wireless operators on duty 24 hours a day.
This was also the birth of the North Atlantic safety patrols and the U.S. Coast Guard.
Now there's a full-time ice patrol.
Right.
They have space satellites. They have an international registry of wrecks and dangerous things at various locations, and you can look that up when you're going somewhere and see what hazards might be there that you wouldn't have expected.
Now, Scott, I'd like to go back to what he said about the unchristian nature of this crime, because if everything that you say is true, and it is very credible, it is there's a lot of substantiating evidence. This very unchristian crime, and the fact that they didn't christen the Olympic as if it was going to be a sacrificial victim, brings me over to the name of the company, White Star. Get it? This is an Illuminati plot. We're talking about the New World Order of 1912 as opposed to the New World Order of 2001 on September 11th. But the fingerprints are there in the methodology, the choosing of special dates to commemorate political achievements. And so I see
special dates and names.
The name
White Star is not an accident.
All right, so White Star. Who's White Star? Lucifer again.
Yeah.
The Illuminati are into the worship of Luciferian theology, you might call it. They follow a ritual of regular and persistent ritual sacrifice. And so I feel that I have to forewarn the public that in the next 2 weeks, these are prime times for these kinds of operations on behalf of these operators. And one of them, listen, Martin Luther King was killed on April 4th. April 15th, the Titanic went down. The Waco massacre, April 19th. The Oklahoma City bombing. Hitler's birthday, April 20th. And April 30th is Walpurgis Nacht, which is basically the night on Ball Mountain.
Hitler's birthday was in April, too. I think it was, April 29th?
What was that?
Hitler's birthday, April 29th.
Hitler's birthday is the 20th. Oh, but coincidentally, Hitler's birthday is the 20th, and he committed suicide on the 30th. That's a very interesting historical fact.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they do it every year, but it's just something to be aware of.
White Star radioed Cunard and said, take all the crew and hold them in a shed until we can come and get them and bring them back to Brooklyn. And you love this. The Olympic, which was the real Titanic, and White Star was very angry and said, no way, you're going to traumatize these people because you expect them to board a ship that's identical to the one that they just were on that sank? No way. So the British government opened up inquiry into this thing. And they used the Board of Trade that had certified that the Titanic was in great shape, brand new sailing ship. They were supposed to spend 2 days checking it out, and they finished up before lunch and went to lunch. So they just said, well, we know Harland and Wolff builds great ships, so they weren't going to criticize, seeing how it was the Board of Trade holding the hearings, they weren't going to criticize anything the Board of Trade did. And they couldn't really criticize John Smith because all the captains said, well, we routinely go through the ice fields at 20 miles an hour or more. But what was interesting was almost everybody from the company that was put on the stand and questioned said, when I boarded the Titanic, blah, blah, blah. And Lord Mersey, who was a fuzzball, he was totally incompetent, but he would say, strike that for the record. And he goes, you mean the Titanic? And the crewman would go, oh, yes, the Titanic. And then 2 sentences later, he'd say, and then the Olympic hit the iceberg. And it goes, you mean the Titanic? Strike that from the record and replace it with Titanic. And he goes, oh, yes, it's the Titanic.
Oops.
And several hundred people who testified for the company all said that it was the Olympic. They just couldn't help.
Hey, Gordon, when all this testimony was going on, did anybody say or elucidate that, while I was on there, I had a glass of water, I was having a spot of tea, and I happened to notice that the tea wasn't sitting quite straight in the cup, since the Olympic was listing to one side.
That's what happened in the stateroom about the listing to port, and then all of a sudden it was listing to starboard because it was...
I mean, that sounds slightly important to me.
Oh, well, there's so many, there are all kinds of flags for this whole thing, So 2 days before they sailed, when J.P. Morgan was told that the ship was going to sink, he called up Lloyd's of London and had the insurance increased to $12.5 million.
Yeah.
The hearing concluded, and they found that Captain Smith, who went down with the ship, wasn't at fault. Andrews, the designer of the Olympic-class ships, he went down with the ship. And Ismay saw a lifeboat being lowered, and it was only half full, so he jumped over and was on the boat and survived. To his shame, for the rest of his life, people wouldn't even look at him, let alone talk to him.
Wow.
And he had to live with that every day of his life. Two findings. The company, White Star, was not at fault. The captain, Edward John Smith, was not at fault. God rest his soul. And the fault was that they had only 20 lifeboats when for the full-size normal complement of people, they should have had 64 lifeboats. And that they need to have 24-hour-a-day wireless operators and forget the rockets. And Lloyd paid $12.5 million.
And that saved the White Star Line.
That saved the company.
And Gordon,
Titanic, as the Olympic, went on to bring over 200,000 Canadian and United States troops over to World War One. Then the real Titanic, labeled sailing as the Olympic, actually sank 2 ships. The first ship was a German submarine that shot a torpedo at it in World War One, and the torpedo hit the hull and put a dimple in it, but didn't detonate. And the captain of the Olympic, that was the real Titanic, turned the ship and rammed the submarine and sank it. Then later, and he didn't stay to rescue the crew, but another ship did rescue the crew.
Where did that happen?
But
Gordon?
anyway,
What time of the year?
That happened in the, I believe that happened, I know where, right off the coast of Ireland.
What time of year? I mean, was the water really cold? Yeah.
Well, palm trees grow in Ireland because of the Gulf Stream, so I don't know how really cold it would be.
Okay.
But,
I'm just wondering about the theory of cold water and the brittle steel, blah blah
and
blah.
then on another trip, it got lost in the fog, and it was the Nantucket Lightship sits off of Nantucket, so that ships won't turn into Long Island Sound, because you can't get from Long Island Sound to New York Harbor. If you have an outboard motorboat, you could, but you can't with a huge ocean liner. So the Nantucket Lightship is anchored there 24 hours a day. It's like a lighthouse, and it has a crew. And it was in the fog, and the captain of the newly named Olympic got lost and ran over the lightship, and 7 crew were killed. The lightship sunk. So the real Titanic not only didn't sink, but it actually sank 2 other ships.
Oh.
But it went on to carry over 400,000 passengers, either from New York to England or England to New York, and it traveled over 1.84 million miles. They decided to refit it after World War One in 1920, and they took the boilers out and the coal, and they put in bunker fuel and fuel engines, and that was much easier to refuel, much cheaper, and much lighter, because fuel also is lighter than water. Mm-hmm. So, whereas coal is like a bunch of rocks.
Sure.
So in 1934, it had finished its useful life, and it was taken to Belfast, where the Harland and Wolff shipyard was. Took out the whole superstructure. They removed all the interiors and sold them at auction. And there are hotels all over the UK that have actual Titanic marble fireplaces and paneling and chairs and tables. Wow. And lights.
That's amazing.
And then they brought the hull to Glasgow, Scotland, where that was cut up, and the superstructure and the hull were both sold for scrap. And that was the end of it in 1935, and the Titanic sailed close to 2 million miles over its lifetime and never sank, and it sank 2 other ships.
Mm. Gordon, I guess the bottom line was that the White Star Line got the insurance money.
Exactly. Very shortly, like within a month, they got $12.5 million.
Wow, they got the money.
So did Silverstein.
The British, they helped the government in World War One. They were requisitioned by the government. The Britannic was built. That was a hospital ship, and it hit a mine off Greece just before the war ended and sank. So,
what was a real tragedy, but also very ironic, was
White Star, and then Carnival Cruise Lines bought IMM Company, International Marine, and White Star, and Cunard. So Carnival owns Cunard, White Star.
That was quite a tragedy on the 100th anniversary of the Titanic going down. That Italian captain scuttling the ship on the rocks. But he was ordered by the company to sail as close to the shore as possible for PR purposes, so that people could see it.
We've discussed this before, but I will repeat it for you. The Earth is wobbling because of the proximity of Planet X, and that makes the GPS go off. And he had done that many times. He had sailed past the entrance of the harbor to wave to his good friend that lived there. They had it on the GPS. They set the GPS coordinates, and the Earth wobbled, and the coordinates were way off, and that's why it hit the rocks.
That may be so.
Now, on the bottom, you have the right rear propeller is visible, and it has 401 on it, which would be the propeller they took. They needed one for the Olympic, so they took the propeller from the Titanic and put it on the Olympic and made. Well, that's what delayed the Titanic a bit, was the fact that they had to make some changes, among them a new propeller.
I think the more important proof is that the dangling nameplate, which is corroding.
Another interesting point is that the Titanic never had a single ounce of gray paint on the hull, and the Olympic, when it was launched, was painted gray because with black and white photography, you couldn't really see the lines of the ship, and Andrews, the designer, wanted photographs to see what the lines looked like if they needed to change anything on the Titanic. So they painted the hull of the Olympic gray, and as soon as they finished taking the pictures, they painted it black. And if you look at the hull on the bottom, you can see places where the black paint, a lot of it's just completely eaten away and because of the rust. But there are places where there's black paint and it's peeling, and under it is a beautiful coat of gray. Another indication is that the bow is almost largely intact structurally, and the whole stern has fallen apart, and that's because it was jury-rigged with beams to hold the sides together.
Very good point. Very good point.
And nobody will ever see the keels because they're sunk in the mud 12,500 feet down, where the pressure is about 7,000.
I thought they found the keels. I think I saw a program where they found the keels and saw that the break at the keel is what proved that the ship had broken in half along at the surface, and that the bow plunged, sailed all the way down, while the other one broke and landed flatly, and then sailed backwards down to land a quarter mile away.
2,000 feet apart, actually.
Yeah, 2,000
feet. The
feet,
actual debris field is 3 miles by 5 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's a international historic site, and the only way you're allowed to go anywhere near it is if you, because RVs were damaging what was left. The only way you're allowed to go near it is if it's for scientific purposes, and the international body agrees that that's a valid purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there's an 11,000 pound piece of the hull is in the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, and with all kinds of other artifacts. And there's a permanent exhibition of the sinking of the Titanic in the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. The pyramid.
That's very interesting. Those glasses may be there. It is a very eerie feeling to see the luggage and all of those artifacts and realize those are real living people. Living people who wore those things and perished that night. And as I said, the soul energy still surrounds those objects. I'm wondering, Gordon, let's tell the people about your show, the whole agenda, on Fridays on Revolution Radio, the same station. It's at midnight.
Yeah, I
and
have,
Gordon broadcasts from Maine.
Show, and Friday night I did the 194th consecutive Friday night show. I've never missed one. And I'm on from midnight till 2 a.m. Saturday, and it's called The Whole Agenda because I inherited the show. I was a guest on the Whole Agenda radio show like probably more than 20 times, and Robert Pepino decided to get out of his own radio show. And he said, "You're the only one I can possibly imagine taking over." So I started in August 1st of 2014, and I've been on ever since. And I talk about 4 things. Any information that I have on those 4 subjects, that's what I talk about. Plus news if I don't have as much of that. The first thing is open contact with extraterrestrials. The second is the coming geographic pole shift. The third is the change of dimensions to a higher dimension, a higher frequency. And the fourth is the new race, which is 100% human. Everybody will live 400 years, have IQs of at least 300, and be completely telepathic with any other living organism in the universe. And that's specific.
Wow, can we stand being around anybody with a 300 IQ?
Gordon, would you like to tell them where they can send donations?
Yeah, geez, if you'd like to help me, I'm bumping along the bottom of the Social Security ladder, and I mean it because my Social Security started at $650. Then they deducted $100 for the government supplemental, so I got $550. Then that's gone down because the government supplemental keeps increasing. Now I get $495 a month, but the government supplemental is only for hospitals. The other supplemental I have to pay myself with Blue Cross Anthem, and that's $420 a month. So I get $495. I pay $420 out. That leaves me with $75 a month on Social Security. So if you would like to help me out with my research and my activities, you would like to
wow,
send donations to PO Box 51, just like Area 51 in Nevada, Ellsworth, Maine, ELLSWORTH, just the way it sounds, Ellsworth, Maine, ME, and the zip code is 04605. You can just put Group Gianninoto. I don't have a web page. I don't have anything for sale. I don't have any books or DVDs. I'm not talking because of money. I'm exactly the same age as Robert, except that I'm 2 weeks older than him. He has to call me the senior partner. But anyway, if you can help out, that would be much appreciated. And
yes, folks.
If you send me your phone number, I will actually call you up, and you can ask me questions. Or send me a postcard. A guy in Louisiana is sending me 9 postcards in a row with Louisiana recipes on it. The last recipe I got was for crab and shrimp stew.
And Scott, how would you like to talk about your projects or your illustrations that you? Those are marvelous Corvettes.
Before we get into that, we're talking about the White Star line, and while you guys were talking, I was doing a little research on this and found an interesting little tidbit here. The White Star Line's head offices still exist in Liverpool, and they're standing on James Street within sight of the more grandiose headquarters of their rivals, the Cunard Building. Now, the Cunard Line itself has, since 1995, introduced the White Star service as a brand of services on their ships RMS Queen Mary II, the MS Queen Victoria, and the MS Queen Elizabeth. The company has also created the White Star Academy. That's an in-house program for preparing new crew members for Cunard ships. And this was the thing I thought was so interesting, since today is the day that the Titanic went down, or the Olympic went down. The White Star flag is raised on all Cunard ships and on the Nordic, in the Belfast, Northern Ireland ship. That's the last, backpedal here a little bit. The last surviving White Star ship is the SS Nomadic. It's in a dry dock in Belfast, and every April the 15th, in memory of the Titanic, they raise the flag. So I guess they are doing it today.
And every ship they named ended in IC. The Atlantic, the Olympic, the Titanic, the Britannic, etc.
What's the significance of that, do you think?
It was a distinction because Cunard was naming its ships ending in NA, like Mauritania, Lusitania, you see?
Okay.
But beyond that, I don't know.
I think it has to do with their secret Masonic beliefs, actually. I think that they're telling us who are the forces at work and contention on this planet. The Titans and the Olympians, for example. And the other interesting thing is that England seems to have identified itself with the kingdom of Poseidon. And many of its ships have names that relate to, for example, the Trojan War, The Ajax and the Achilles were two of the cruisers that kind of tricked the Graf Spee into destroying itself. The Ajax, the Achilles, Ark Royal, they have all of these very, very interesting mythical and Poseidonic names. I think they associate themselves, the Royal Navy, with the kingdom of Poseidon. Makes perfect sense. But that they are descendants of these gods and demigods themselves, including, among others, Orion, Neptune, Ajax, Achilles, Leander, and later Amphion, Apollo, and Phaeton. Scott, you were going to say something?
Robert and Gordon, why is it, since we're talking about England and all the things that you just mentioned, Robert, why is it that they... Pardon me?
No, go ahead. We didn't hear your question.
Say again? Yeah. Why is it that it seems like England is yielding to Islam? I mean, I've been following the news from London, and this place is out of control. They've got an Islamic mayor who's Mayor Khan, and
right.
There's all this stuff having to do with totally open borders, and they just cannot import
very strange
enough Muslims. They're just giving it all over to the Muslims, and we all know if anybody who's studied the history of Islam, you give them the upper hand, they will take you over. So why are they totally? It seems like they're totally yielding to Islam.
I think they've been taken over.
It's the fact that Queen Elizabeth I married into the German royal family and had service to self, and they tried to kill every member of the Stuart royal family, which are actually descendants of Jesus. So you have this two sides. What you're witnessing is the final battle between good and evil going on all around us every day right now.
Mm-hmm.
The other strange thing is that I've seen recently that the Queen of England has declared herself to be a direct line descendant of Muhammad. And
what?
So look it up.
I read that too.
They have they gave a genealogy, and they seem to be side shifting. I think out of expediency, they think convenience at the moment. That they are going to change their culture. But I thank God that Brexit succeeded, and there is a pushback against the Islamification of England, or the formation of Chrislam. I have spoken openly that I believe the Pope is a heretic, that he's the false prophet, and that he is trying to concoct a new world religion that he thinks is going to go down as Chrislam. And there is no way, in any contortion of metaphysics and theology that the Pope or anyone else can reconcile the theology of Islam with the theology and the metaphysics of Christianity. That is a physical, psychological, and theological impossibility. They are mutually exclusive. In the same way,
is a dark ruse akin to communism, and
it is communism. As a matter of fact, I coined the word communism in 1999 to describe what I was seeing. And people thought I was really extreme and fanatic. But then in 2002...
Robert, say that again, Robert, because we lost you.
I said that in 1999 I coined a word, communism, to depict or define something that I saw formulating. Then I was called, extreme or a fanatic. But in 2002, Osama bin Laden himself urged all members of the Ummah, that's the collective soul of Islam, all members of the Ummah to support communist insurrections anywhere they may occur, because communism and Islam are the same thing. He said it explicitly. Communism. They call it Islamofascism, but I call it communism. So yes...
communism and Islam and the New World Order have one thing in common, and that is the elite get everything they want, and the common man has less than they need.
Absolutely right. The United Nations looked at all the systems of governance, democracy, American republicanism, European socialism, and I think the UN has decided that democracy is too unwieldy, and that a totalitarian scheme, such as we see in Islamic countries or in China, for example, Baathists, Baathists are the ideal for the United Nations in reality. That's a communist Islam that is separated from the religiosity of Sharia. It's kind of, it's actually what Saddam Hussein and what we're seeing in Syria, their party is the Baathist party, and so was Gaddafi. He was Baathist. And basically Baathist is communism, Arabic socialism, as taught by the Soviet Union to them when they infiltrated.
What a terrible combination. Arabic socialism. Yikes.
Arabic socialism. That's actually what Baathism is.
So, Gordon, we're just about out of time. You want to tell our listeners where they can listen to your program?
Who, me?
Yeah, you.
Yeah, you can listen to my program on revolution.radio, just like if you're listening to this, you're on revolution.radio, and you're on Studio A, and I'm on Studio A. So Friday night at midnight, and if you can't make that, you can sign up for the archives, $5 a month.
Are you putting your programs on YouTube?
No, I have diminished eyesight, and I can't read anything. Okay. I use a close focus telescope to see where to click with the mouse on the screen, and I use an eye loop to read one word at a time.
Yeah, well, maybe you can find somebody who will help you put them up on YouTube.
I've been asking every show. I ask for somebody to volunteer to be my producer.
Yeah.
And I ask for, but that just doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, we'll see if we can help you. By the way, before we part, I just want to take a moment to remember the great Art Bell who passed away recently. Yeah. He was what made us happen, Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM, and then Midnight in the Desert. My sympathies and my condolences go out to him, his family, his entire team, and all the people who worked with him. It's a sad loss.
Robert, what's your favorite Art Bell quote? I'll tell you what mine is. I used to listen to his show, and sometimes when he'd have a guest on that would tell him something that was particularly mind-boggling, he would always say, "Huh."
Well, I say huh, and I say yeah. No, I don't remember any particular great quote other than that, but I do remember the most memorable show, Art Bell, is when some guy from Area 51 called up in hysterics that he was on the run, the guys were 3 hours behind him, and he started to reveal all of these nefarious things that were going on with extraterrestrials and the U.S. government at Area 51. And he had split the scene, and he was in mortal peril, and he felt like he was going to die within a few hours. And he confided in Art Bell his story. They didn't kill him. He called up about a month or two later, and he was more calmed down, but he was still telling the same story. So, once again, this is now 4:58 in the East, and it's 4:15. April 15th, the day the Titanic went down, the day the IRS and the Federal Reserve went up, and a day to remember, a night to remember is coming. Keep your eyes open. Don't be fooled by false flags or tricky media. Beware, April 15th, April 20th, and April 30th. We may be in store for another episode of Global Theatrics.
Well, let's hope not.
So, thank you. And I pray for the president. I am happy that the situation in Syria did not cause World War III, and that things are looking up for the better. Folks, this is Robert Morningstar with my guest Scott Teeters, my co-host, and my guest Gordon James Gianninoto.
Great to be with you, Robert.
Thank you. Have a good night, and talk to you all soon.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Scott.
Likewise, Gordon. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio.